Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the Professor, Greg Dooley, and the pundit, Steve Clark. Men, take the mic.
That's right, it's the Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark, and we are proudly presented by Nick Hopwood, a certified financial planner, founder, and president of Peak Wealth Management. Retire with confidence. Greg, we saw Nick out at a wonderful place, the Little Brown Jug, out on Friday night. First of all, good to talk to you again.
Great to talk to you. Great to see Nick. That was fun. We'll talk about that later. But also, awesome, incredible traffic on our podcast. Thank you. We keep the trend up. I know everyone wants to hear what our thoughts and what's going on with all the stuff at Michigan. We'll get into that today. But thank you. Remember to follow, rate us, tell your friends, keep spreading the word. You're making it happen for us, and we're excited about it.
So we're a weekly podcast, but with all the news that has been going on about Michigan football and sign stealing, things are changing on a daily basis. So, Greg, we're going to do the best we can to be as current as possible for this podcast for you and for me and for everybody else that's listening. So let's kind of go over what we have learned over the weekend.
Yeah, let's do it. Take us through it, Steve. And I've got a little bit of insight. Hopefully I can share into it, too, with some conversations I've had.
So since Friday night, where we learned that Tony Petitti came to Ann Arbor, and he was going to be in Ann Arbor anyway for the Big Ten field hockey tournament that was going on, decided that he was going to take the message from the remaining 13 schools in the Big Ten, their coaches, their athletic directors, but there was meetings and Zoom calls that Michigan was not a part of. Tony Petitti got the opinions of what all the other coaches and all the other ADs had to say and brought that to Jim Harbaugh and Ward Manuel and President Santo Ono and said, look, we're going to have to suspend Jim for 2 games.
Well, what we found out was he already had a letter in his hands before the meeting happened, and that was from Santo Ono. We learned about the letter later. It was delivered before their meeting. In fact, if you read the letter that Ono sent, it was, I know we're going to have a meeting, but here's where I stand on this. And basically, Ono told Petitti to pound sand. Well, I know you have a mob of people with pitchforks in the conference, but whether it's you, the Big Ten, or the NCAA, we are going to have to demand due process. And that's what he asked for.
And now the question is whether he's going to get it or not. Tony Petitti was probably a little bit surprised with the response. It wasn't quite shove it, but I think Michigan was quite surprised by the number of schools, all of them, which not only seemed to want just a 2-game suspension, they wanted a whole lot more. In fact, the word over the weekend was that the coaches and the ADs of the other schools basically want Jim Harbaugh suspended indefinitely until the NCAA concludes its investigation, which is indeterminate. It's not going to be next week. Essentially, everybody in the Big Ten wants Jim Harbaugh gone for what was going on.
Yeah, that's it. You know, did they do a vote? Did other people say do the 2, do more, suspend him pending this? They want something now, and they want Harbaugh. And this is where the NCAA has been going with its penalties. The Big Ten's echoing it. They're not punishing programs necessarily. They're not inflicting pain on the student athletes. They are going for the man. And this is what they're doing in this case. And, you know, obviously Ono knew this, something was coming, preemptively got together. They wrote this letter. Nonetheless, it doesn't sound like Petitti went, okay, that makes sense, and walked out. It doesn't sound like that was the case. In fact, as we record this, Steve, there does seem to be a bit of a standoff of position going on where this is unresolved. And as we record this right now, where it's a game of chicken or something, where we're daring you to try this, and some other stuff has come out since. But that's where it seems like we're at right now. It's
right.
Like we're daring you, Big Ten, to do this. How far will Michigan go? And I have a little insight to it, but what else do you have here?
I think it's a waste of time to actually relitigate the whole thing. We've kind of done that over the past couple of episodes. Yeah. We've dealt with the absurdities of the things that are involved, but everybody now wants their pound of flesh, and they're tailing their own argument and ignoring a lot of the facts that are going on. going with the speculation. It is a mob mentality. It is a situation where the Big Ten coaches feel like they can get rid of Jim Harbaugh, use this as an excuse, and they're all in on this. Connor Stalions officially resigned from the University of Michigan football program. My feeling is Michigan has plausible deniability that their coaches didn't know it. Whether that needs to be proven may not even be necessary because the head coach is responsible for their actions from their subordinates. Greg, do you want to talk a little bit more specific about that?
Sure. So there was a bylaw change in January that previously said a head coach was presumed to be held responsible for the actions of all institutional staff members. And they changed it to say a head coach shall be held responsible for their actions. So when you see subtle language like that, it's important because they deliberately made that change. And it means, watch out, we're going to enforce this. So it's important right now. My hunch is a couple of things, is that the regents at Michigan were a little split on how hard to push as of like game day. Okay. Mm-hmm. The other thing, my hunch is that Ono has an issue with that language with the NCAA and may be willing to put Michigan out there to challenge it. And that's where I think we're at. And it makes sense that we've got different regions. That's what they're there to do. But trust me, they're heavily involved. They have to be, right? We know that. But that's where we're at right now. As we get through this, we're learning more over the weekend. It does sound like Michigan's going to be in a position to fight this legally, potentially involve judges. We're starting to hear, and that doesn't surprise me. The other thing, Steve, is you have to assume, agree with me, that Santa Ono at some level was satisfied with the explanation of what happened with this from what he heard from the football team. Do you agree?
Yeah, he's sticking his own neck out there. And he's also sticking out the University of Michigan in general throughout this whole thing. So I am glad from a football perspective that President Ono feels that things are not as bad as what other people may want you to believe and is willing to defend Jim Harbaugh, is willing to defend the Michigan football program. But everybody's kind of in a wait-and-see moment. There's a bit of a standoff. And do you wait to see if cooler heads prevail, or do you go right after it and attack it? And there's different ways to attack it. You can go after other schools for what they've done. You can just cross your arms and say it's not going to happen. You can line up a judge, see if it can have an injunction be done. What do you think is the best strategy for the University of Michigan right now? Because last week I would have told you, sign Jim Harbaugh to a big fat contract and tell them where to go. That may not be the best tact at this point when everybody seems to be against you.
Yeah, and I had heard that was probably going to happen, an announcement, and it hasn't. Again, as of the recording of this podcast, and I think that would have been a good strategy. But it does seem like either Michigan was a little surprised by the strength of the demand, if you will, that Petiti has made. So this is wild. There's a positive in this, right? Well, first of all, Michigan football is bigger than a single man or coach, right, than Harbaugh, and for what it's worth. And I know we're talking about like a potentially very historic season that we're going in right now. But look, we got a president in Ono who gets it. Can you imagine if Schlissel, we're still the president here? It's a positive. He just started his tenure. He's the guy who gets it. And historically speaking, Steve, we went through drama where the conference at the time was against us, and starting in 1906. And we had won all these football games. We had beaten our rival, Chicago, and the conference came after us. But who didn't support us then was our president. Our president was actually kind of the leader of these reforms, many of them focused on Michigan football. What did the athletic department do? They left the conference and went independent. So the difference here is we actually have alignment. Presumably we have alignment with the regents, with the president, with the football team, with the athletic department. One person we haven't heard from, though, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, is Ward Manuel. Now, his boss is speaking, and so protocol-wise, if your boss says it, okay, there's my boss. What else? What do you want me to say?
Right.
But I don't know. It might be good to hear from Ward. What do you think?
So Ward Manuel was at the press conference after Michigan's win over Purdue. A lot of people decided to gather around Ward Manuel to get his comments. He said he wasn't going to say anything. Asked why he wasn't going to say anything. He said, because I don't feel like saying anything.
Why don't you feel like saying anything?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So eventually everybody kind of turned around and sat back down. Somebody asked Jim Harbaugh directly. He says, how do you feel about President O supporting you? And this is exactly what he had to say.
It's deeply appreciated.
So that was nice. To me, it's interesting. The mood is going up and down like a roller coaster. I sense that the listeners and anybody that follow Michigan football so deeply, their mood goes up and down. One day they're feeling absolutely great about how things are going to go, and the next time they're starting to wonder questions like, are we going to leave the Big Ten over this? I mean, this is because it's so emotionally charged right now. These are some of the questions that are being asked. But this roller coaster ride is not only with just you at home. There are people in the broadcast world who are covering this. You know, Sam Webb staying up to 4 a.m. I'm watching
I sense the tone in his. It was at times it's dour, at times it's defiant. Right, I've sensed that. So great call. I'm seeing that.
And it's not only with that, but there's the higher ups that are really, really invested and involved in this that I think probably feel the same way. Do you get that feeling?
I can confirm that feeling with some of the higher ups without identifying people. At times are concerned, and at times we got this is the tone I'm kind of getting. So a little bit of confidence in how we're going to defend this. It's wild, man, and it's historic. It's historic for sure.
Well, it's getting so emotional that I asked during the Countdown to Kickoff pregame show that despite how emotional it seems, Tony Petitti's between a rock and a hard place to where basically the other 13 universities basically said, if you don't do something about this right now, we're going to lose faith in you. So that's almost like a direct challenge to say, look, if you don't give us what we want, we might find a new commissioner. I mean, how far is the other universities going to the wall over this for things that they themselves actually do? The other emotional part of it is where it makes it very hard for Petitti is that he's certainly gotten the sense now that Michigan might fight this in court. And if Ohio State doesn't get their way in particular, is there a scenario where the Ohio State Buckeyes, or the Michigan Wolverines for that case, may decide to look elsewhere and see if the grass is greener in the South, the SEC?
Yeah, it's not out of play here. The longer this goes without a resolution is probably better for Michigan. That's why the mob wanted a quick action, because they know that time's probably not on their side here if this gets played out. Steve, I got a question for you.
Sure.
If I offered you a 2-game suspension right now to make both of this go away, and again, I'm a fairy, okay? That's a drop. I'm a fairy, or a genie is probably a better word. 2-game suspension right now, Penn State and Maryland, and this all goes away. This thing goes away, the Counter Stallions thing with both the Big Ten and the NCAA. Would you take that deal?
Everything going away? I would probably have to take that deal.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it would go away with a 2-game suspension. I think that's just a starting point.
But I'm a genie, Steve, and I get to. That's the scenario, right? I'm saying they'll drop it, right? But your point is it doesn't go away with what? Pundits, with other actions they can take.
If the 13 universities are willing to go out on this limb right now and say that Jim Harbaugh's got to go, and we're threatening you as a commissioner about whether you're going to have this position anymore, I don't think it goes away. I think it's a starting point for them, and I think they'll ask for more as things go along.
Okay, well,
they have already tried and convicted the University of Michigan.
Yeah, so you gather a mob with torches and pitchforks, and you ask what they want and give it to them. Ono's response is completely justified. What are you talking about? Like, we don't get to defend ourselves. You don't even tell us what you're exactly accusing us of. But it's not written down. What are you suggesting? And we get to respond to it. At least give us this. That's kind of what Ono's saying.
The idea that you have to suspend the head coach until the conclusion of the NCAA's investigation is like putting a guy in jail with no bail and with no charges. There are no charges. There are no notice of allegations. The Big Ten doesn't even have an investigative arm. So it's clearly the mob mentality, and you would hope that cooler heads prevail, and maybe it will. But it just doesn't seem like it in the last 72 hours.
It sure doesn't. And that's where you make a call. How far are we going to dig in? And there are other means through legal action, through judges, through injunctions. And it sounds like Michigan's pushing the chips in and going, let's dance.
When it's all said and done, the pressure for a Michigan football team to finish this season undefeated has never been greater to me in the history of Michigan football. In the mob movement that wants Michigan football canceled, if they lose a game throughout the regular season in the Big Ten championship, it will be perceived as a validation to those that feel that Michigan is only where they're at right now because of Connor Stalions and the method of which he was able to crack the code. If Michigan wins, like they've always had, then at least there's evidence out there that they are winning without the info in the same way that they had been in the past. So it's way too much pressure on the kids. It's not like Michigan goes undefeated every year as it is. They went undefeated last year through the regular season. They went undefeated in 1997. Most of the time, you're going to slip up somewhere along the line. And the thing is, if Michigan loses a game, everyone, basically in the court of public opinion, is going to say guilty as charged.
Yeah, and conversely, if they blow the doors off Penn State on Saturday, it might quiet some people, but it says a lot. It starts Saturday, and this game is huge, man. This game is huge. I'm going to try to get out there to see it. So I'm with you. There's tons of pressure. I didn't even think of the impact on the student athletes and the kids, as you say. We'll see what happens.
The great news about that is, if you listen to Donovan Edwards, it sounds encouraging that the outside noise isn't bothering him. Let's take a listen.
Like, we don't care like what outside people say. All we care about is what people in Schembechler Hall say. You know, that's the people that are there on a day-to-day basis. That's the people who actually know what's going on inside of Michigan football. You know, like, you guys could say, like, oh, y'all know so much about Michigan football, but in reality, y'all don't. I don't even know if y'all know how to block up an inside zone scheme. But to the point, like, we don't got to prove nothing to nobody. You know, just keep doing what we're doing, and that's going to take us very far, as it has so far.
All right, we've heard this type of thing before, that they don't follow what's going on in the outside world. Most of them do. But just listening to him speak and the way he said it makes it sound like he could give a care what the rest of the outside world is thinking and cares more about what's going inside the walls of Schembechler Hall.
I agree. Starts Saturday. Blake Corum did come to my class, and if he was showing the pressure, I didn't see a bit of it. He's focused on winning a championship. That's all he said. He looks the part. So, and speaking of Blake, he got in the end zone 3 times on Saturday.
He did, climbing up the all-time Wolverines touchdown record with 3 touchdowns. Anthony Thomas is the guy who leads Michigan all-time in touchdowns recorded at U of M. Thomas has 55 rushing touchdowns. Blake Corum has 47, so it's possible that he could reach it.
Modern-wise, 71, Willie Heston.
Okay. Yes, I know. There's always a few of you out there. Michigan wins the game over Purdue. That's the first step, 41-13. They weren't their best. It was not the way that they had played against Michigan State, the way that they beat them 49-0. It was a strong start, but it kind of waned in the second quarter a bit. JJ was a little bit off with his targets. The receivers were also dropping the ball. I thought this was a good adjustment by the coaches that I didn't think of, because I could tell that JJ was throwing behind players as they were crossing the field on the run. And what they decided to do was they decided to throw more routes where a receiver would sit down and clamp down in the middle of a spacious part of a zone, or creating a zone bubble that a receiver could just sit there and wait for the pass to come to him. And JJ wasn't off with those at all. And once they kind of made that adjustment into the third quarter, Michigan's offense started to move again. But Jim Harbaugh said, look, he had so many yards there, 355 yards overall, but judge a quarterback on third down, which was 7 of 13 for 92 yards. Not exactly JJ-like in the previous 8 games, but 7 of 13 on third down is really, really good. And a lot of the time, Michigan was facing third and long.
I think people were hoping for 50-plus point win. I mean, pretty close. And back to this, okay, now there are no signals. We're still killing people, and we absolutely blew them out. I mean, we did. We just didn't play our best. This is where the bar has moved.
Right.
I mean, we've outscored the last 2 opponents 90-13 now since the Counter Stallions things, but fans were like, well, yeah, a little disappointing. And then you had the late touchdown, which I think got people a little bent, because it did look like we put back, say, Mason Graham and some of the starters back in there, and they got pretty fortunate on that last play. But again, it's basically the end of the game. Another late touchdown.
And people are, again, using it as ammunition. Oh, they didn't cover the spread. Therefore, we know how important that sign-stealing thing was going on. The defense did fine. They gave up 2 field goals, both on short fields that started at the Michigan 34-yard line. Then the last-minute TD, making the final score 41-13. And all I could say about scoring in the final minute is what else is new? I mean, Michigan State was the anomaly where they preserved the shutout.
Yeah.
I would think almost half of all the scoring that happens on Michigan's defense occurs in garbage time in the final 5 minutes of the game. As for the game itself, Purdue's quarterback, Hudson Card, the man is a squirrel. I mean, he could just scat, jump, step forward, on the run, throw the ball when you least expect him to throw. Certainly can run around a little bit. He didn't get sacked too many times, but he was certainly pressured and hurried quite a bit.
For a team with their record, I thought their defensive line was pretty impressive, and I give them some credit because it really did look like their players played their butts off the entire game, despite getting hammered pretty bad by Michigan. Like they never let up, so they're playing for the guy. Did you see the awkward hand touching at the end of the game?
Yep. Ryan Walters couldn't wait to get out of there. Went, slapped 5, didn't even look him in the eye and went. But I see that so often with other coaches that don't have a gripe with one another. I don't think it was a big deal, and I think mountain is made out of a molehill on that one.
Harbaugh's had some really awkward handshakes in the pros, right, causing words to happen after the handshake. It's so weird. So
Jim Schwartz.
Yeah, Schwartz, and then Pete Carroll. What's your deal, man? What's your deal? So when I'm kind of with, I really am not a fan of Pete Carroll, but I was kind of with him on that one. What is your deal, man? So the pregame, though, the getting back to everyone at the stadium, it was a night game. It was a bit of a circus, right, with all the fans in the town and people. When you have a night game at Michigan, many of you know there's this slow crescendo buildup of like the game where people are parking at noon, some at 6:30, and the town gets taken over. I went to the SAE Mudbowl. By the way, SAE won 26-24. They raised over $61,000 for the Charles Woodson Foundation Fund at Mount Children's Hospital. There was a late touchdown by Fidel, who, by the way, was Tom Harmon's fraternity back in the day, and that is the traditional Mud Bowl matchup. It was always SAE versus Fidel. That changed a few years ago, where the team that plays SAE in front of their house wins the tournament, and that's how they get in. Well, coincidentally, Fidel won, so it was a little traditional. So it was cool. Get this, Steve. A spectator got in a fight with one of the refs in the game, and I've seen it all. And if you know the Mud Bowl, it is basically a nonstop brawl. It's a football game, and they play and they score, but there's no holding, there's no pass interference. It's supposed to be two-hand touch. It's tackle, and there are punches. There are real punches thrown.
So there are no fouls for unnecessary roughness.
Nothing, but they try to break them up. The game gets broken up all the time with fights, and again, usually a punch or two, not like a guy getting knocked out that often. This I've never seen. This is someone like our age, Steve, or older, got in with a ref who said the game was getting out of control. And he physically hit the ref, and the ref is apparently a bodybuilder. He lifted the guy up.
No one can believe the superhuman strength of Thunderlift, Adrian!
And it started a brawl of sorts with the people around and the ref. It was insane. So I've never seen that before, but it was a lot of fun being out there.
So, Greg, I got a personal story when it comes to fraternities and playing football. A lot of times football is a rush event to get to know people better. You play the game of football, and going into rush week when I decided to go into a fraternity, I had banged up my wrist really bad and had a soft cast on it, and it couldn't open a door with it. It just sucked. Wanted to play football. And I went to this one fraternity, and these guys were like the University of Michigan SAE house. They were all athletic guys, tri-sport guys. There was like a giant thorn rose bush in the middle of the field, and they were throwing ball carriers into it, coming away bleeding or whatever. And
nerds,
I'm like,
or just ball carriers?
Well, let's get those nerds! Nerds! Nerds!
yeah. People who were involved in the game. People who were involved in the game.
Okay.
It was a hard-hitting tackle football game. Bushes, let's throw people into it. And I said to myself, it's a good thing I didn't play in this game. And then I realized nobody talked to me during the rush event. So I left that event saying, if you're invited to play football again, you're going to play football. And you're going to play it hard, and you're going to play physical, and forget the cast and how much your wrist hurts. So within a week, there was another event, and guess what? They were playing football. This is one of the few chances in life where you get to do it all over again and a shot at redemption. Now, this was a night rush event, so you're playing in the middle of the dark. And I remember what I had learned at that other house. Play hard, be physical. Opening kickoff, I sprinted down the middle of the field as fast and as hard as I could, avoiding blockers, overshooting the returner, but coming back around, grabbed the return guy from behind, whipped him over around my shoulder, and threw him into the dirt. And I came up feeling that was a great first impression. And immediately, people got me off of him and said, dude, it's two-hand touch. Then after the game was over, I looked inside the fraternity house and noticed everybody wearing their Lacoste sweaters and V-necks and looking very preppy.
Preppies, yes.
Very preppy. And I went 0 for 2.
Bad read.
Because nobody talked to me after that either, because I was a guy that basically took down an active on a kickoff return for what apparently was a two-hand touch football game.
Steve, unbelievable. Bad read. I think you were better off for not going to those fraternities either way. The first one sounds a little weird, and the second one sounds like not your style nor mine. So
I was not invited to either of them. So
well,
I think I was better off.
So we won one of the IM leagues on a Hail Mary. Josh Cohen to David Rogal will be heard for another 100 years of IM football at Michigan.
Johnny Wrangler to Anthony Carter will be heard until another 100 years of Michigan football is played.
So there you go. But that was a good memory for me. But it was we still like to play. So all good, dude. The pregame show, of course, started later, right? You guys started at 3:30. And I believe your son at Purdue, as we talked about, came in with some of his friends from Purdue, and that was cool to see.
It was, and they had a lot of things going on. We actually, as a family, my wife actually went to a tailgate party as well. And one of the people that we were going to the tailgate party with, we were going to give this person a professor and pundit shirt. And somewhere amongst the things of carrying everything down, jackets, stuff for the tailgate, we were exchanging in our hands quite a bit. And then we got there and I said, "Where's the shirt?" My wife says, "You got it." "No, I gave it to you." "No, you gave it back."
Replay, the red flag.
This What Really Happened replay.
Yeah,
like a commercial.
Exactly. So I just assumed, it says, well, it's in the middle of the street somewhere because it's gone. Now, just to give yourself a little pat on the back, Greg, I'm at the countdown to kickoff. At the end of hour 1, somebody comes up to me and shows me the missing professor in the pundit shirt. He goes, "I found this out in the middle of the street. I know who it belongs to." And he showed me very quick. It's 2 sentences, but it was said very quickly. "I've always wanted one of these. Do you want it back?" He caught himself as soon as he had said it. If something you've always wanted, you go ahead.
I feel like he's earned it.
And I think he kind of realized what he said. That wasn't intended for me. I'll give it back. And I said, no. It is yours. So, I will make it up to the person it was originally for.
That's funny. Also, I mean, there's probably, 500,000 people in Ann Arbor, and someone who happened to know our podcast found it.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah, and I think technically, now that we're getting into legal stuff, see, I think he has salvage rights. I think that is, according to the law, maybe we got a new friend of mine, Lou, who's a lawyer listening. So, Lou, can you tell us, does he have rights to that?
I gave it to him, so he definitely has the rights. He definitely has the right.
That's a contract.
So this tailgate was in one of the parking lots, and the parking lot wasn't full, so there was a number of people just throwing the football around. And I was pretty impressed. This dad, like in his 50s, and his son in his 20s, are throwing the ball a good 30, 40 yards, tight spiral, all that. And I was like, man, I can't throw the ball anymore, Greg. I mean, I can barely get it 20 yards. It hurts my shoulder every time I throw it. I was impressed. I looked down, my concentration waned, and then all of a sudden I hear the dad go, "Catch the ball!" Okay? And I'm like, there's no way that other guy, his son dropped it. And I looked and I see this like 14, 15, 16-year-old kid has now joined the threesome. And he dropped the ball. I don't know how he dropped the ball, but I'm like, dang, that's a little nasty.
It is nasty.
And then the kid picks up the ball, and then he throws it, and the ball wobbles sideways and hits the windshield of an Escalade. It did not break the windshield of the car, but it was this kind of weak throw that went, and it bounced the floor, and Dad didn't say anything because it certainly had my attention at that point. He could probably keep his mouth shut. But I'm like thinking of the Dr. Pepper ads.
My boy is becoming a fan.
Catch, babe!
Oh.
That was right to you.
Right.
Or you got the dad who wishes his son was into football, that type of thing.
Yep,
and I think I was just kind of witnessing that whole Dr. Pepper commercial live in front of me.
It sounds like you did. I love it. That's great. Yeah, the disappointed dad. That's hilarious, man. What else? Oh, so before all this, we did the happy hour at the Jug. A lot of people showed up. Thank you for all those who did. And we did it with Jill Gordon, who at the time of this podcast drops, she will have completed the new section on the Little Brown Jug. And again, it will be above the Minnesota M. She's painting a section for 5 new scores. It's a multi-day process. She's been doing it, yes, in a lockdown Schembecker Hall, Steve, where it is locked down. Jill got through because she has a job to do. She had permission.
Good.
And she's completed the section, and we'll be painting the score. And by the time this podcast drops, rest assured, we will be good for another 4 more scores after this one on the Little Brown Jug. So we got to hang out with her. She actually painted someone's replica jug while we were there, painted the scores on for them of previous scores. It was kind of cool to see, so it was a lot of fun.
And so now there's 4 scores left in this 5-spot deal, and the way the Big Ten is scheduling things out as of right now, assuming that there are no more teams being added to the Big Ten, or in this week, we're not subtracting any teams from the Big Ten at this point.
If we leave the Big Ten, we better hang out in the Jug.
Yeah. Michigan and Minnesota look like they're scheduled to play twice in a 5-year period. If they play in the Big Ten championship game, would the Jug be open for the taking?
Yes, I argue it would, based on the fact that we played twice in 1926. And there's a whole circumstance of why we played twice in 1926. But if you look at the Jug, if you look at replica Jugs, you'll notice there are 2 scores. Michigan winning both games in 1926. We actually played them in the regular season twice. The Jug was on the line both times. So, if asked, and I might be someone they talk to as a historian, I would say, yeah, absolutely, it's on the line. And I don't think anyone disagrees with that, right? So, Big Ten championship, the Stagg Trophy, who's a contemporary of that time period where the Jug came from, and the Little Brown Jug would both be, theoretically, presented up on the podium. That would be epic.
I'm just picturing right now the NBC pregame show on the field at Indianapolis. Let's bring in our Jug insider, Greg Dooley from NVictors.com, who will reveal to us whether this counts as a Jug game or not.
Yes. Would
that be great?
I would milk it.
You could say.
I would go, no, but you can hear about it on The Professor and the Pundit, where I'll render my decision, right?
All right, that sound means it's halftime here on The Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark. And Nick Hopwood has slipped into the studio to join us. And maybe, Nick, if I ask nicely, he'll give us a little bit of a free advice. So seeing money markets jump up to over 5%, I know that if I put money in a CD, this is the rate that I'm going to get. But if I buy a bond, then I'm getting a pretty good yield at the moment, but that could change over time. Given the current conditions, Nick, would you advise people to get a CD or invest in the bond market?
From my point of view, if you need safe money, it's the money market. All the other money, I think, should be in bonds. And the reason why is because a CD, you do lock in the term, but for bonds, you basically get a much longer term at today's good rates. So most CDs, a 5-year, will be lower than the money markets right now, whereas the bond funds, depending on the level of risk, can be 6 and 7%. And that's good for 5 or 10 years. And that's a huge point that I'm trying to make with people. Because they're like, oh, we'll just go all money market. I'm like, no.
And we are in the fourth quarter of 2023, so if you want to get a hold of Nick and ask him any questions, or you just want to ask for a couple of ideas, go to peakwm.com. That's peakwm.com. All right, Greg, notes around the Big Ten. Again, it seems great that Rutgers played Ohio State very well for a half. In fact, had a 9-7 lead. But they explode in the second half. And when you realize that Rutgers has 3 field goals with the maximum distance of 22 yards, that means Rutgers had the ball inside the Ohio State 5-yard line 3 times and had to settle for field goals each time. That's not going to do it. Ohio State ended up winning the game, but it's given Michigan some confidence.
We've got a great opportunity, but it's hard to look past Saturday against Penn State right now for me.
All right, the surprising finish of the Big Ten weekend was Illinois at Minnesota. It was one of those deals where Minnesota's win probability rate was extremely high. It was 4th and 11 from Illinois' own 15-yard line with less than 2 minutes to go, and Luke Altmaier had to go out of the game because he was injured. So they bring in the backup quarterback, John Paddock, again, 4th and 11 from his own 15-yard line. He goes 3 for 3 for 85 yards, and Illinois wins in Minneapolis by a score of 27-26. Minnesota people are going crazy over this big letdown. Minnesota is 3-3 in conference play. They're a game behind Iowa for first place. Minnesota has the tiebreaker over Iowa, but you got to catch Iowa first to have that apply. They're absolutely livid that they let Illinois, who had just won their second conference game, to come back from the dead and win that game.
No, and it seemed like both Minnesota, they were kind of on the rise, and Nebraska, who then lost to Michigan State, which surprised me as well. For State's first win, and I can tell you from Michigan State's perspective, it was a big deal. I don't know that they've ever finished without a win in the Big Ten Conference before, and they were staring that right in the face, and they got this win.
Yeah, and another big piece of that, Greg, it was the last time they actually played at home at Spartan Stadium, because the last home game was supposed to be against Penn State after Thanksgiving weekend, but they decided to play that game on a Friday at Ford Field instead. So this was the last opportunity for the Spartans to win in their own stadium.
IU got their first conference victory as well?
That's right. They beat Wisconsin, the best team in the West, allegedly. And it's, again, Minnesota says, what a golden opportunity to be in first place. Indiana beats Wisconsin, and you let this Illinois team come from behind with a backup quarterback in the final drive to do that. Iowa found a way to win at Wrigley Field. I have been told that it was only the 7th highest score at Wrigley Field this year.
No kidding.
10-7 win. So Iowa led 7-0 with a few minutes left to play. Northwestern scores a touchdown to tie it. Then Iowa had no offense whatsoever, managed to drive down the field to set up a 53-yard field goal as time was about ready to expire, and their kicker, Drew Stevens, gives the nighty-night sign after kicking a 53-yard field goal. I just can't believe the lack of offense, and they still win. They're 7-2 overall.
Did we even talk about the Brian
play.
Ferentz thing on this? Did we even talk about
No.
Yeah. And of course, or is it the end of the year he's gone?
He's going to be gone at the end of the year.
Yeah, okay.
So he's allowed to coach.
It's kind of weird.
The key thing in this is that an interim athletic director made a power move that the former athletic director, who has been there for years, couldn't or wouldn't make. And that is basically saying Brian Ferentz is going to return to the Iowa football staff for the 2024 season. A lot of popcorn there. The mere admission of that makes people wonder in Iowa City whether Kirk Ferentz would retire. The fact is that she's an interim athletic director, and she left the AD job at Ball State from the Mid-American Conference to join Iowa, probably being told you're going to be the successor. But when Gary Barta left, she was only named the interim AD, and she makes this move, and you say, well, she must think she's got the job. If you look back at Beth Goetz's history, she was an interim AD at Minnesota, and as an interim hired a head football coach at Minnesota, and within a year she was told, you're not the full-time AD.
Oh, jeez.
Pack your bags. So,
all right. Well,
wow.
This has to be kind of popular, though, that she stepped up and did this with the Iowa fans, I would assume.
If they can get a competent offensive coordinator to come in and still have Kirk as their head coach and still have Phil Parker as their defensive coordinator, if they can have those things, Beth Goetz is AD for life in a lot of those fans.
Wow. They just feel like they're playing the entire West Division is playing a different level of football right now. And they're going to get crushed.
And it's called junior varsity.
Steve, we got a second for a quick NIL update.
Yes.
Yes. This is kind of a big deal. The same judge that has ruled on a couple of NCAA cases in California basically came down on the NCAA, and there's a suit out there where players have gotten together and they are suing for back damages for not having the right to have NIL. In other words, yeah, you gave us this right reluctantly in 2021, but what about all the other years we should have had it in the first place? On top of that, they are suing to get access to TV revenues from the conferences and all this stuff. People are using big numbers like $4 to $5 billion potentially it could cost the NCAA. But the players are represented by the same firm primarily that won the Alston case and made the big crack in the O'Bannon case, which really started all this. So this could be big. So we got to watch it. Now, this was a circuit court. You can see is it going to be appealed? But it's a big deal, and it might be one of those things that brings revenue sharing sooner rather than later to athletic department. So we got to watch that.
Do they have $4 billion to give?
No, they have about $500 million in assets. But I think some of that's trademarks, some of that's card tricks. I don't know what else they have. I don't know to what extent. Well, they own the NCAA tournament. That's an asset in and of itself. They could probably sell that. They're going to have a garage sale with old NCAA logos. I don't know.
Outside of football, outside of sports, I am a little concerned at the idea that you can get money or be considered guilty of something that wasn't a problem being guilty of before coming back to haunt you. There's a lot of things in life where it was acceptable to do something, say something, then afterwards when it's no longer considered appropriate. I mean, I guess we do see that today.
It happens.
People do lose their jobs over things they say back then that wasn't considered offensive, but is offensive now. And because they said it back then, they lose their job today.
Yeah, no, there's lots of that. But usually in these court cases, it's usually about signaling something. Like the Alston case didn't explicitly allow NIL. But what it said was it showed that the Supreme Court had sympathy and tolerance and acknowledged that the NCAA couldn't control how athletes are compensated. You can say, well, it's kind of the same thing. Not really in the decision, but it opened up the floodgates to all the other court cases, and the NCAA knew it was over. They said, okay, we got to allow this. This was probably going to be a similar thing where maybe actual damages aren't provided for back pay to athletes, and we got to go find them all and pay them for money they don't have, by the way, as to your point. But it might be the other cases come up for revenue sharing, and they have a Supreme Court opinion that's going to back them up, and the NCAA is going to see that, the conferences are going to see that, the teams are going to see that, and they're just going to allow it. It's usually a bigger picture type ruling, impact, I should say, that they have. So we'll see. What else? Oh, I had John Beeline in my leadership class. He's the best. I got to spend some time with him. I got to drive him back. He doesn't live in Ann Arbor area anymore. I got to drive him back to his hotel, and we had a chat.
Wow.
And the guy's amazing. I had Blake Corum and Denard come in, and I had to convince my class a little bit. A lot of them know who Denard is just because their parents knew who Denard is, right? But just to explain how big Denard is. We had Scott Hirth from the MDen in a week prior, and I asked Scott Hirth, I'm like, who was bigger, JJ or Denard? And he's like, Denard. And like children came out of the womb wearing a 16 jersey, right? When Denard, everyone was walking around with a Denard jersey, no, not Fab Five level, but really close, right? But it's football too, which is bigger scale.
Well, and quite frankly, 10 years ago doesn't seem like a long time ago to you and me, but to your class, if they're 9, 10, 11 years old, saying, tell us all the great things about Rick Leach.
Yeah.
When we went to school, we remember, he was one of the best quarterbacks who played at Michigan, but couldn't say like what he did or anything like that.
My daughter, who's of the age of my students, says she remembers Denard and she remembers Peppers. those are the athletes, that from Michigan that she remembers. So that makes sense. So get this, Steve. I am about the time this drops. Well, Ward Manuel himself is supposed to come visit my history college athletics class. So with all this stuff going on, I'm going to reach out and go, hey, you're scheduled to come in. Just a reminder, we're going to do a Q&A style that kind of thing. And I think I'm going to have to say, look, is there anything off limits? We're off the record. I won't be talking about it other than general impressions on this podcast. I think it's 50-50 between us that he cancels or says the timing doesn't work. And he actually scheduled around his participation in the college football playoff committee, which is earlier in the week. So it should be interesting.
Michigan number 3 in the initial playoff with Ohio State being number 1. I would not get bent out of shape about where Ohio State is ranked. If Michigan beats Ohio State, they'll be ahead of Ohio State. And if Ohio State beats Michigan, Ohio State will be ahead of Michigan. The on-field results will dictate where they're ranked. It really doesn't matter right now. Yeah,
the committee said clearly that, to me, like, hey, we're not taking in anything that may or may happen in Michigan. Right now.
I wonder if the way ESPN and other media outlets are pressuring the Big Ten to do something because it's only just and fair that they do something without due process. Do they actually go after the College Football Playoff Committee that says you have an obligation to do what's right and fair?
Well, that's how other teams could get involved, like outside the Big Ten. Like if they want to jump in this torch and pitchfork, they could demand that
Sure.
the committee do that.
There is a lot on the line. There are a lot of teams that are still undefeated, and there are a lot of teams with one loss on their resume that have a quality win on their resume, which is why I wanted to get some of the national games of note to see where we stand. So Washington remains unbeaten after beating USC 52-42 over the weekend. I expected fireworks, and I expected Washington's defense would actually make a stop, and that's exactly what happened. USC, which gave up scores in the 40s to 4 different opponents now, allowed Michael Penix to throw for 256, but also allowed running back Dylan Johnson to rush for 256 yards. The Huskies are 9-0. I think a Pac-12 team is going to be in the playoff this year. It's whether it's going to be Washington or whether it's Oregon. I expect those two teams will face one another in a rematch for the Pac-12 championship. The first time they played, Washington won by a narrow score. The winner of that game, I think, is going to solidify one of those 4 spots.
It seems like everyone's keeping Oregon on their list of teams to watch, with one loss. But we had a little shakeup in the Big 12.
Yeah, they were nearly eliminated Saturday, just so close. First of all, Oklahoma suffered loss number 2 against Oklahoma State in their last matchup of the foreseeable future in Bedlam. Meanwhile, K-State got a field goal as time expired to force overtime against Texas. Now, if you're a Michigan fan, you want Texas to get loss number 2 as well. The Longhorns got a field goal in overtime. The Wildcats went for it on 4th and goal from the 4-yard line. That is a real questionable move. They couldn't convert. The Longhorns, with 1 loss and a win over Alabama earlier in the year, I still have them alive in the playoff hunt. Again, you have 1 loss, but you have a great win over Alabama. And speaking of the Crimson Tide, Greg, Alabama beating LSU 42-28. The demise of Nick Saban is still premature. They played their best game this past weekend and only have to win one of their 2 remaining conference games to win the West in the SEC. That's either Kentucky, which could give them a game, Auburn, which is a rivalry game. I expect Alabama to win both at this point, but Alabama owns the tiebreakers over Ole Miss and LSU. I think they're pretty much a lock.
I got to admit, in his old age, I'm starting to warm up to Nick Saban, whether it's the Pee Wee thing on the radio show that we talked about, or
he called again, Greg.
Pee Wee did.
Pee Wee called in again into his radio show and got back on the air. I was surprised.
I love it. And his little hits on Pat McAfee, which I understand Nick Saban makes like $1 million or something to do that, are pretty good. I don't watch the Pat McAfee show, but I'm flipping around and I've seen him on there, and I'm warming up to the old boy, I gotta say. Kind of like Larry Bird at the end as a Pistons fan and a Lakers fan. At the end of his career, you kind of were doing the hat tip of respect and kind of respected him. So I don't know. It's kind of happening to me, but we got a huge one, Steve. All of the stakes involved. Yes, if we drop this game, we could come back and beat Ohio, and that would probably be, if we had to choose one game to win, it would be Ohio for sure. But this is an important game for Michigan coming up Saturday, man.
Every game is important, as I mentioned on the outset. Never has there been more pressure on the Michigan football program than to win the remaining games on their regular season schedule than this Michigan team in 2023. Penn State blew out Maryland last weekend in College Park, 51-15. Penn State scored 28 points in the 4th quarter, but you have to give credit to their defense, which is the biggest asset to their team. The game was well in hand already, but after Penn State scored a touchdown, Maryland threw a pick on its next play. Then they fumbled on the first play of their next drive. But Greg, the good news is on their 3rd possession, they didn't turn the ball over until the 2nd play of that drive. This defense is absolutely outstanding on all 3 levels. You got Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac up front. Abdul Carter was a freshman All-American last season, and the secondary features Kobe King, who's out of Detroit, by the way, and they could have 3 first-round picks in the draft on that defense, and they're led by former Miami Hurricane head coach Manny Diaz, who plays very tight man defense. Michigan is dominated and they look under control, and J.J. McCarthy is one cool customer, but he has not faced a defense since Ohio State in Columbus that is going to go after him. And I think because of the competition we played, we just don't know how this Michigan offense is going to respond.
Yeah, no, I'm impressed with what I've seen in their defense, and it's Happy Valley. It's not at night. It's going to be a noon game, which I think is going to be a good thing for Michigan.
It makes a difference.
Yeah, it goes back to like, hey, there was a reason why they caused a lot of those turnovers in the previous game. I think we need to hold on to the ball. I think we'll be okay if we do that, Steve. But gosh, man, we'll see. We'll see. It'll be a lot of fun, though.
The offense is led by Drew Aller. I think he's going to be a great quarterback when it's all said and done. But he's in his first season starting, and James Franklin doesn't like him airing it out much like JJ was kind of harnessed last season in his first year as a starter. The run game is supposed to be one of the best in America between Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. If you remember, Greg, there was like these tandem of running backs, and it's like, who's better? Yeah. Is it Ohio State's running backs, Michigan's running backs, or Penn State's running backs? And when it comes down to it, neither of these three running teams are living up to the summer billing. In fact, there's nobody really in the Big Ten that's rushing all that well, except for Minnesota. It doesn't matter who they're plugging in. They seem to be having a guy, like four of them, who are rushing for 150 yards or more. I guess Minnesota's kind of overwhelming people with the way they run the football, but Braylon Allen is not doing it at Wisconsin. It's mostly a passing league, and if you can't pass in the Big Ten this year, you're not very good. And with 12 out of the 14 teams in the Big Ten are not very good. People in Happy Valley wish they had good receivers as they've had in the past, but Keandre Lambert-Smith leads the team with 550 yards and 4 touchdowns. And like Michigan, the tight ends are very productive in this James Franklin offense. The top two combined for nearly 300 yards and 8 touchdowns on the season. Again, this is a Penn State offense, doesn't usually like to go for the big play. They like to chip, dink, and dunk, and that helps Michigan out. Michigan's defense will be able to slow down Penn State's offense. I think it's how good is this Penn State defense to Michigan's offense at this point.
It's what we've been waiting for, man. And this is our third season, first episode, and it feels like we're entering a new season in every sense of the word right now, and that starts Saturday.
I feel like this Michigan is finally starting their Big Ten title defense with this game out in Happy Valley. Yeah. And so excited to talk about it. A reminder that I'll be able to give a very in-detail look at the Penn State Nittany Lions on the Michigan Insider with Sam Webb and Ira Weintraub Wednesdays at 9 a.m. And that podcast is also be able to download as well. And again, we want to thank people for listening to our podcast and remind people to subscribe and rate. And anything else you want to mention, Greg?
Follow us. Support Nick Hopwood if you have the means. You want to know more about Nick, he's easy to find. Put all this stuff in the show notes. And guys, it's been a thrill. This is our third season, and we're not going anywhere. We got 12 more episodes for you, and we hope they all involve talking about active Michigan football games or upcoming games, we're going to find out a lot starting on Saturday.
Michigan football, back-to-back Big Ten champs, Greg. Go Blue.
Go Blue.